What's going on, guys? My name is Wade with Tech Daily, and in this video, we're going to be comparing the new Samsung Galaxy M51 to the Samsung Galaxy A71. Now, some of you guys might be thinking that this is sort of a strange comparison. They're different series devices with different number schemes too, and you probably thought that maybe the A51 would be a more comparable device. But the fact of the matter is, and this sort of spoils the whole video, but the M51 is basically just an A71 with a huge battery stuffed inside. That's pretty much it. The rest of the specs and features and things are nearly identical between these two phones, which sort of makes it a tough comparison actually, as far as what phone you might want to get for yourself. So I'll give you all my thoughts here. I'll touch on a couple of other small things you might want to consider, and hopefully by the end, this will help you decide which one of these phones might be best for you. First off, let's quickly talk about pricing and availability, since that already might be something that impacts your decision. Now, the M51, like most other M series phones, is going to be primarily available in the India and Asia markets. It's unfortunately just not a device that's sold in the US officially, though you can still find some outlets that will ship it to you if you want it, which is how I ended up with mine. And the price for this guy is gonna be between $350 and $400 US, depending on where you're located and the configuration you may go with. The A71, on the other hand, is widely available around the world, and there are actually a lot of different versions of this phone out now. There's the A71 5G here in the US and abroad, which you might see, but for this video, I'm just using the regular standard A71, the non-5G version, which came out back in January. And since this device has been out for so long now, you can actually pick it up on places like Amazon for as low as $350. And I'll just quickly mention that the A71 5G, that is a different phone entirely. Different specs, obviously with 5G support too, and it sells for a much higher price. It's not exactly a direct comparison with these two other phones, so I won't go too much further into detail with it, but I just thought I should mention it. For the M51 and regular A71 though, these two phones are pretty close in price now, and if you guys are interested in doing some comparison shopping of your own, I'll leave some links down below in the video description to where you can get these phones at their cheapest current prices. Physically, I think it's pretty obvious that the M51 and A71 look almost identical. To start off, they are both fairly large 6.7-inch devices, and at least from the front, their design and form factor are the same. They both have the Infinity O camera cutout up top, super slim bezels along the side, and really no bottom chin. They are very fresh, very modern looking devices. Around back, both phones rock a plastic rear cover, and you might notice that the M51 has a very plain design, while the A71 has a lined pattern and subtle shiny rainbow effect. I personally think I like that extra touch on the A71 to give the phone a more unique finish, but either way you look at it, the material here is all the same. What's a little more different is the finish on the edges. The metal-like frame on the M51 is sort of a dull silver, while the A71 has a polished, color contrasting chrome finish, which again is just a nice touch and in my opinion makes the phone look a little nicer. Now in the hand, these two phones actually feel very different from one another, and that's because the M51 is a much thicker, much heavier phone. This is due solely to the fact that the M51 has that huge battery inside. It's, I think, the selling point for this phone in general, and you do feel every bit of that extra mass. It's a dense, thick, heavy device, and the best way I can describe it is just that they basically took the A71's form factor and filled out the entire rear so that the camera bump disappears. That's pretty much the difference, and it may not come across so well on camera, but like I said, you can really feel how different the weight and the thickness is with these two phones. Taking a look around at everything else, on the left side, both phones have the SIM and SD card tray for expandable storage. On the right right, you'll see the volume buttons and power buttons, but on the M51, its power button actually doubles as a fingerprint sensor, which I'll talk about in a second. Down below, it's the same setup for both, with the headphone jack, USB-C port, and single downward firing speaker. And across the back, a nearly identical quad lens camera setup for both phones. So let's touch on these fingerprint setups, since that is actually another major difference. With the A71, of course, you get that fingerprint reader under the front display. It's good enough. I've gotten used to it, though it isn't quite as fast as the flagship phones or even a physical sensor like the M51 has. The M51's power button fingerprint reader, I think, is actually a great addition. These M series phones usually have a fingerprint sensor on the rear of the device, but this setup works really well, and I absolutely prefer it over the in-display reader. Not only is it easier to feel for, it seems to be faster and more accurate, it's a little quicker to retry if it does fail, and all in all, I consider it a great addition. Of course, both of these phones also have Face Unlock as an additional option as well, with the phones sort of going back and forth with who's fastest. I think they're pretty close here with this setup. Okay, so let's talk about the internal specs, and the first thing we need to mention is the difference in battery power. The M51 has an absolutely massive 7,000 milliamp battery packed inside. The A71 has a still respectable 4,500 milliamp battery powering it, but it's obviously no match for the M51 in comparison. And if I'm being honest, if you're looking for just the one reason to consider a certain phone over another, this is it right here. The battery capacity on the M51 is one of the largest on any devices out right now, and considering everything else to be equal, it is absolutely the reason to get this phone instead. The A71 for me has almost always lasted a full day on a single charge. It's been solid, but the M51 is poised to last 2 days or more on a single charge. That's super impressive, and beyond that, you can even use the M51 as sort of a power bank to charge other devices you might have via the USB-C cable, and that's really awesome. Both phones do support 25-watt fast charging, neither phone has wireless Qi charging, so that's all the same, but the big difference there is that huge battery capacity on the M51. Now, interestingly enough, the rest of the internal specs with these two phones are actually pretty much the same. The newer M51 offers the Qualcomm Snapdragon 730G processor and Adreno 618 GPU paired with either 6 or 8 gigs of RAM, and the A71 offers either the 730 or 730G depending on where you live, the same Adreno 618 GPU, and the same 6 and 8 gig RAM options. On the software side of things, both phones obviously have the latest Android 10 update, but the M51 I have here ships with One UI Core 2.1, and that's going to lack some features like Samsung Pay, Knox security, and a handful of other things, while my A71 has everything you would expect. Now, I don't think I can go too in-depth with every little software thing that's different. It's going to kind of depend on where you live, what region your phone is from, and what's supported officially, but just know that there's a chance your M51 likely won't have some Samsung-related software additions that the A71 would likely have. With that being said, though, the general performance on these two phones feels pretty close, and if you're curious, both of these devices here have 8 gigabytes of RAM, but my A71 has the regular 730 series processor. I personally don't feel like that makes a difference. You can kind of see that the phones go back and forth as far as which device launches and loads stuff first. The big thing here really is just that while we've come to sort of expect some Snapdragon processors on the higher end A series phones, a lot of these M series phones, even this year, got stuck with the Exynos chipset, which tends to perform worse. With the new M51, however, that's just not the case, and I think the 730G chipset is exactly what this phone deserves. It brings it even with the A71. I think it also allows it to compete with some other mid-range devices on the market, and it's a much better long-term investment too, now in my opinion. It's kind of unfair for me, I think, to call a winner based on performance and specs here, since they're technically identical, but with this M51 phones sort of breaking out and receiving the Snapdragon processor, I think that's just an extra point for this phone on principle alone. It makes this device in particular just that much more attractive. With the displays, we already mentioned the screen size and design, of course, that's all the same here, and the specs are actually pretty much the same too. The 6.7-inch screens on both phones are Super AMOLED Plus panels that come in at resolutions of 2400 by 1080 and pack in the same 393 pixels per inch. Now, side by side, for whatever reason, I have noticed a slight difference in color temperature. The M51 seems to be a cooler, bluer display, while the A71 is warmer with more of a hint of yellow, and that's without changing any of the screen color options and settings. Generally speaking, you can make the displays look nearly identical with a slight white balance or tint adjustment. Maybe the A71 looks a little more colorful with all else equal, but generally speaking, you can expect the displays to be pretty much the same. They look great, they're bold, they're bright, and it's the same viewing experience no matter what you choose. And neither phone has any extras like QHD resolution or a high refresh rate either, so it's all the same resolution and the same features. And the final thing here that is also pretty much the same with these two phones is the camera setup. Both phones have 4 lenses around back. A 64 megapixel main lens, 12 megapixel ultra wide, 5 megapixel macro lens, and 5 megapixel depth sensor. From researching all the specs, this hardware seems to be the same. There might be a difference in the depth sensor, but that's all I was able to find. Up front, the selfie cameras are also the same 32 megapixel lenses, though again, digging a little deeper into the spec sheet, the aperture is slightly different, but nothing major to speak of. With the shooting modes and functions, I think you can see that everything is the same. Night mode, slow-mo, pro controls, it's all offered on both phones. Along with 4K video on the front and rear lenses, there's video stabilization there, the 64 megapixel high detailed shooting mode. As far as I can tell, and as far as you can see, there doesn't seem to be a feature or setting or mode that's different between these two phones. Now, in practice, I have actually noticed that from time to time, for whatever reason, the M51 seems to produce a blue tint on some pictures in comparison. It's not every single time. The white balance is just a little off, though I'm working on a more in-depth camera comparison to really put these phones to the test and see if anything else is different. More often than not, though, the rear camera shots actually look identical with exposure, contrast, detail, and everything else. With the front cameras, though, I don't know if Samsung purposely tried to improve the M51 setup, and at first I really didn't like the results, but actually compared to the A71, the M51, in my opinion, looks like the better shot. It's more accurate with the color and skin tones, the lighting is better, there's less smoothing on my face, it doesn't look so washed out either. Like I said, I'm working on putting together a more in-depth camera comparison here so we can dive a little deeper. There might be some differences in results, but I don't necessarily think camera quality should be a deciding factor. So here are my final thoughts. Considering the fact that most everything else is the same between these two phones, the M51 is simply the better device based solely on the fact that it packs an absolutely massive battery inside. That's the deciding factor if you have the choice between these two phones, though unfortunately, like I mentioned at the start, the M51 just isn't available for everyone. So you might be out of luck to begin with, but if you have the choice, the M51, in my opinion, is the way to go. But what do you guys think? Which phone do you prefer? Let me know in the comments down below. I'd love to know your thoughts, of course. But hopefully you guys did enjoy this video. Be sure to follow Tech Daily on Twitter and subscribe to the Tech Daily YouTube channel if you haven't already. And I'll see you guys later.